Hello and welcome back to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit. Oh.
Today you're listening to episode 1 of season 2. I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader in all things CI and CD. And today I'm joined by Justin Cormack, CTO of Docker. Justin, so great to have you. Thanks for joining me for the inaugural season 2 episode. Great pleasure to meet you. And I will just say, as an outside observer, always been fascinated by Docker. I mean, personally, and just in terms of how it's affected my own software delivery for someone who's been working in this industry a long time, and as someone whose organization, I guess, has shifted as a result of everything that people have changed, with the onset of Docker. I don't know if onset is the right word, but it kind of feels like the right word. Like, it just showed up and changed everything.
Yeah, it kind of was like that at the time.
Yeah, and we all had to change with it. And so I'm so fascinated by the technology and then by the company. Like, I think that the two have had slightly different arcs. The technology sort of showed up and changed everything. And then Docker, the company, was sort of like, okay, now what do we do as part of this? How do we participate, capitalize, whatever, which is a really interesting a story that I'm excited to hear. So again, thanks for joining me. Great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
So let's jump right in. Like, first of all, you haven't always been CTO of Docker, correct? So I guess in a few words, tell me a little bit about just your role now and how you got into Docker in the first place.
Yeah, so I've been at Docker for about 6.5 years now, and I've been CTO for just over a year. I started off actually via an acquisition. It was Unikernel Systems. And I came in and actually the first project I worked on, we started Docker Desktop. Then I've kind of done a lot of things across Docker in the time here. I've worked a lot across open source and Docker Engine, Docker open source. I worked in security for a long time, and kind of ended up kind of moving into the CTO role after Docker was restructured. It kind of felt relatively natural to do that at that point. I think I'd been there long enough and learned and kind of become a sort of central part of the organization during that time.
So you mentioned a couple of really interesting things in there that I think start to build the background of the story, right? And adapting. So you talked about open source, right? That's one thing that's interesting about Docker is, again, this technology came out into the world and we all started thinking differently about how we deliver, but we could do that for free, right? So that's kind of a fundamental business challenge that I think companies face when they start with something open source and then look to build the model around it. And then, you mentioned restructuring. So obviously there was, again, this kind of arc of, I just keep saying onset. Yeah. It was like Docker showed up out of nowhere and suddenly we were all doing everything differently. So, I guess first, what were you doing? I mean, what was your sort of connection to Docker at that time? Did it feel like that? Like, oh my goodness, everything just changed in terms of how we think about operations and delivering?
I mean, yeah, I wasn't a Docker at the time when it came out. I came across Docker a little bit after that, and I've been doing a lot of I think my first kind of real introduction to things are changing around our industry was probably Puppet and learning about kind of that whole configuration management and like let's automate things at scale. And Docker kind of seemed like it kind of came on from that. It was about doing things at scale. Although when I think about it now, I'm not sure that I kind of think that is actually the best way of thinking about it. I think because Docker changed so many things at once. And I think that's part of why it was successful. I think that I still, when I think about it, I think perhaps the most important thing about Docker was just the sharing of what you'd built and that kind of community piece of it that started being built, and that was probably the biggest innovation, around that kind of tooling was that you could suddenly just use things from other people in a really straightforward and easy way. And that was the big innovation.
From a delivery perspective, I think the thing that is super fascinating is the, complete packaging, right? I'm not just shipping a piece of software now into a totally different environment and hoping that I got close enough in sort of where I designed it, developed it, tested it, but I'm packaging the whole thing. The entire environment is going with it, right? So that was to me like a really, really fundamental change in software delivery, and certainly changed how we had to build our entire product, right? Which is a really fascinating transition to go through. So you mentioned community in there. When we talk about open source, that's often a huge, huge part of it, right? Like people rallying around something. And then let's get right to the heart of this in terms of, highlighting restructuring. So how is it that you end up with this massive community, this product that everybody loves, people are using it, they're fundamentally changing the way they deliver, and then Docker as a company is, not really, I don't know what other word to use, like not really succeeding or not succeeding as a result of everything that it's created, right? And ending up in a place where we got to stop and sort of fundamentally rethink our role in all of this.
Yeah, so I think there was a few things. One thing is like when you make something massively game changing, it's always very difficult to see how every game is going to be changing and how the world is going to be changing. So I think that the route we initially went down for monetization had a logic to it at the time. It was like, well, people will want to host this thing in production. That's, let's build a, classic enterprise sales motion around that, because people are going to be building this, but they want all this Docker infrastructure. They've seen the amazing things that these large companies want to buy this thing and run it. But I think there was a bunch of issues with that. And I think really at the heart of it was that community. And Docker's community was early adopters and people who were excited about how Docker was changing things. And the big change that to a large extent was, partly facilitated by Docker, but partly was happening at the same time, was the rise of cloud and running things as a service for people. And the vast majority of our early adopter community were moving to Amazon and Google Cloud at the time, and we were trying to sell an on-prem enterprise product. So actually we were trying to sell it often to people who were not actually Docker users. They just had heard about this thing and it was magical that they heard, but they didn't want to go down the route for various reasons of, let's run this amazing thing in Amazon or run this amazing thing in Google or whatever. But they said let's add it to our on-prem infrastructure, like we were thinking, like we did with VMware. This is VMs versus containers or something like that. And so we were building a product where most of our enormous community were not potential buyers of the product. Mm-hmm. And so there was a real disconnect between the community and who was really buying the product and using it. And we were just trying to we were talking to people who were like, yes, I'm running this stuff in Amazon and, running containers at scale. And then against that, we're talking to people who were very slow moving organizations who were not using Docker at all. And they thought that if they bought it, then they could get all the benefits and adopt it. But that process was really slow. And we were doing a very slow sales process with the whole education, explaining what it was, trying to find the people in the organization who got it, and and they were kind of leading it. But it wasn't, it wasn't a market where we could just convert some proportion of our actual adopters into this product at all. And so I think that was a real contradiction that we didn't really see at the time. And I think that that kind of business did seem like the obvious thing. It's like a standard at the time enterprise product. You have to bear in mind also, I guess, that there were fewer models for how open source goes to commercial success at the time, even than there are now.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. And was there sort of, I guess we'll get to like the point where everyone said, okay, what are we doing? How do we change this in a second? But I assume that still that investment in community, whether it was truly an investment or whether the community just built itself, I mean, I'd love to understand that, ultimately paid off, right? At some point when everyone is using your product as a basis for the things that they do and really build that that relationship with you. You sort of talk about like, who are we targeting and who's the buyer, right? I would say particularly now, and it's continued to evolve over my time at CircleCI, the developer as at least the influence of the purchase is getting more and more weight, right? Like software teams or software, like engineering managers are realizing what I want are the tools that my developers want, because that's going to make them productive and it's going to make us succeed, right? And I'm not going to hand these things down. I'm going to see what my team wants to use and we're going to go invest in that. Did that eventually sort of come back around despite those maybe not knowing how to sell into that organization initially? Did it come back around and the support of that community was what really ended up helping?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, when we restructured the company in like 2019, that was really the view was like that there is still this community. The developers love Docker. Let's build a business based on that exact model of selling what the developers are actually asking for, using, loving. We didn't know exactly what the shape of it would be at the time, but we said let's focus purely on the developer. Let's not deal with production. Let's not compete against Amazon or anything or any of that kind of thing. But let's just focus on building a developer-focused business. I think that there was a lot of people at the time who said like, but developers don't like to pay for anything as well. But I think that we kind of took the view that actually that was kind of that wasn't a given necessarily, and developers expect their management to give them the tools they need and the things they need to do their job. And developers badger people until they pay for CircleCI, and they badger people until they buy them a new MacBook, and they badger people until they get their Docker subscription. I think it's that's how they want to work, and so I think that's I think that we saw that was still a reasonable a good option to build a community around the people who really had supported us all that time.
This feels like a great moment for a PSA to, any developers listening. Your management wants to buy you tools to make you effective. Like that, you say developers do badger their management, but they don't all, honestly. Like a lot of developers think, oh, well, there's no budget, whatever. But like the time and energy of developers is extremely valuable. Companies are trying to deliver great software to their customers. And if that can be improved, right? If that workflow can be improved with some Docker tooling, your management team is willing to pay for it. They just don't necessarily always know what's going to make your life better. Talk to them about it. I mean, absolutely. And I think it's such a great foundation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It has been a shift. And I think some companies have formalized this more in terms of how they buy and how they think about buying things. And ask your developer what tools they want, because they're probably going to make really good decisions in terms of velocity of your business.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, we're a CI/CD company. We think about continuous improvement, right? I think we all do these days in software delivery, but I gotta, at least put my bias on it. So what was the point? Like, I think there's something really interesting in here. You talk about restructuring and stopping and saying, okay, something's not working. What is the business that we have? How do we go after that? Like that's congratulations, first of all, for having that moment, for getting past that moment and getting to a place where, you're really able to, benefit. Like I want you to benefit because I want Docker to be awesome. And like the company needs to be around for that to happen. So what did it look like to kind of go from we built a thing, but we don't know what to do now to, yeah, we're like deeply embedded in the developer world. People love the product. They're willing to pay for it. That keeps us going so we can make the product better for everybody.
it was clear that the existing business wasn't, although it was, successful in some measures, was not sustainable in the form it was in. It was, the sales was expensive and slow, and because we were having to educate customers about what Docker was and those types of things, and it was a very competitive market, as well. The on-prem Kubernetes market was just, everyone was in it at the time. The investors made the decision to sell that business to Mirantis, who've done actually a very good job in turning it around into a sustainable business using their existing customer base. I think it's taken them a couple of years, but it has stabilized and turned around under a different kind of ownership. So we were kind of, we made that decision to keep the bits that were tied to that developer community. We kind of sat there and sort of took stock of what we had. We had a lot of stuff we were giving away for free that had been kind of part of the onboarding of Docker for years. Docker Hub and Docker Desktop and Docker Engine and the Docker official images and all the kind of pieces we had at that point. They weren't a business, but they were millions of users of them, and so there are millions of people out there, using them every day, and who we could see, were the people who were enthusiastic. But it was really a matter of working out what shape that could possibly turn into a business.
I mean, again, huge fan of that reflection. Okay, we have some things that are working. Like, what are we good at, and how do we capitalize on that? I think is really, it's just a good process. It's a good process to go through, whether you're delivering sprint to sprint on software or whether you're looking at your overall business. So it's an awesome story. And the thing that I want to take away from that, like the sort of positive, optimistic part of me, is if you've built a really great product that people want to use, they'll be happy to reward you for that, I guess is the best way to describe it. Like, I don't think anyone is saying, oh man, let's just stop using Docker because now it's not, not every piece of it is free. I think a lot of us were probably like, really? They're letting us use all of this for free right now? Like, like at some point when you've built something that is that great and that valuable to everyone, they're like, okay, there's value here. Like, I understand that. And I think that kind of to the point of capturing developers and getting them, to buy into what you're doing and give that positive feedback to them, that we're all sort of in this space of, okay, we have to be able to give you enough to truly experience what it will be like. But then if it's amazing and you love it, you're going to be willing to pay for it, sort of thing. And that transition, again, I think we're all comfortable with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the free on-roads to things has been, I mean, you can argue that the big value of open source is just you can try it yourself. You don't need to ask someone for a trial. But then we also have, free tiers for SaaS services. You can try CircleCI, and get familiar with it and realize why you like it and how it'll improve things. And then you can start paying for it. And I think that's kind of, that model has really changed the way software is adopted. I mean, I think open source kind of forced that because it was like, well, it's just there, you can use it. And in the early years of open source, it was just like people, businesses didn't know people were using Linux. It was like, oh no, we don't have any Linux in our business. Oh yes, you do. It's hidden under the desks and it's in the servers you don't know about. It's like, and that's, as a way of letting people just find out what's good, what's new, what'll help them. It's just amazing. Just zero permission, just try it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good both directions, actually. I mean, when I think about, I always use CI/CD analogies because I think about it all day long. But, we care a lot about fast feedback, right? And if it's really fast for someone to try my product because they don't have to pay for it, it's sort of just started. So maybe I don't even know what the value is yet. I can give it to them and they can say, oh, it would be cool if it did this, or it'd be cool if it did this. And now I can get that cycle happening quickly. So it's like fast feedback on my business, right? Like, in theory, we talk about software delivery here, but ultimately software delivery is about building a business usually, or building a product that people love. And so that opportunity to get that feedback, right, very early versus, okay, this is a super beta version, but you need to sign a contract and it needs to go through your legal and security is going to do a review and all these kinds of things. You're just not going to get those early adopters who are going to say, oh, this, maybe, as you said, a technology that ended up changing way more things than was ever conceived at the point that it was designed, which is awesome, right? But you're not going to know that until you put it out in the wild. And how are you going to get people to even try it? Well, I love the story. I love this whole arc. Congratulations again on the success and finding this place, and on working on something that is so fundamental to what we do. And I think we talked earlier that we're trying to talk a lot more about these sort of lessons and how we recover from things that that maybe didn't go to plan, but ultimately we find some way. And so we're going to add a feature this season called the Red Build Rewind, because we love the notion of red build. It's kind of interesting. Like, people are sad when their build is red. I'm just like, oh, it's telling me something. This is useful information, right? I can learn from this. Does this tell me something about, like, maybe I didn't understand the software well to be able to get this right the first time, whatever it might be. So as we get ready to wrap up, did you have an example maybe of a time that, something went wrong and it felt sort of catastrophic, but ultimately you ended up learning something really valuable from it that's helped you in your career and life?
I think to some extent, this whole story about Docker is that I think that critical thing of, like, you're on a path and you think that it makes sense, and you have got to reflect and think, like, is this actually, am I making use of all the things I've got that I could be making use of? And I think that was kind of Docker had built this amazing community of millions of users, but we were building a product for a few thousand of them. Like, there's a big mismatch there. Mm-hmm. And I think that thinking about, like, if you take stock of your sort of where you are and your opportunity, are you actually making use of the things that you have built and you have around you? And, like, this fantastic community was this enormous asset for Docker, and it's we're helping so many people by building tools for them and giving them tools, and, like, but if we don't we don't make use of the feedback we get from these people, if we just deal with a small subset of them, it doesn't really make use of that at all. And so I think standing back and thinking, how am I helping all my users? How am I how am I different from someone else in this situation? Because I think that we were kind of doing a strategy that someone who wasn't Docker could have done. In fact, lots of people were doing the same thing as we were. Like, we weren't making use of the uniqueness of our situation at all for that. And so I think that kind of process of reflection, where you sit there and you think, like, what do we have that we are not using? What could we be doing differently? Like, that is really important.
Yeah. That's great. That is actually as an outsider, I'm excited that I came away with that conclusion from your story. I like, congratulations again on sort of living it, on having that moment and saying, there's something that we can do differently here, and really finding it. And I think that focus on, your unique contribution is huge. Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for joining me. Love hearing about the story. Again, I've been an outside observer for a long time. I want, Docker to be successful. We've done so much with it ourselves. It's one of the few things that I cite as fundamentally changing the way that I think about software. There's a lot of tech that we get hyped up about, but it has really changed what so many of us do. Super, super cool. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this podcast, subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Tell your friends about it. If you want to hear us talk to someone or talk about something, find us on Twitter at CircleCI. Again, Justin, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.